Well, hey guys, welcome back to the weekend Q&A. Let's get into it. What is your opinion about hair SPF and any product suggestions? There's hair SPF and there's scalp SPF. Protecting the scalp from UV damage, very important because skin cancers on the scalp related to sun exposure are common. That's an area where they commonly crop up. Now your hair, depending on the overall thickness and density, is going to offer quite a bit of sun protection naturally, but any exposed areas of the scalp you need to take measures to protect. How do you do that? Ideally, a hat. That's honestly the best way. Now, you can put your facial sunscreen on your scalp. However, it can get on your hair strands and they may not like that. It may clump up on them. They may become dull, unmanageable. Sunscreens in a gel vehicle tend to go into the scalp and hair-bearing areas in general much more readily than, say, a cream would. There are also formulations marketed as scalp sunscreens. One I tested out and tried a few years ago was from Coola, and I thought that one was pretty good. It did have fragrance in it, however, as do all sunscreens marketed for scalp that I came across at the time. My overarching recommendation is to protect the exposed scalp with ideally a hat, but say you have a bald head, then yeah, your facial sunscreen is going to be fine to use on your head, and you're not necessarily going to need to worry, depending on the extent, of course, on it getting on your hair and messing it up if you have a bald scalp. Now, there's also the question of sun protection for the hair strands. Is that something you need? Well, your hair strands will not get skin cancer, but they can be weathered by UV exposure, and UV filters in hair care products can protect against that. If you have blonde or red hair, your hair is going to be a lot more vulnerable to UV mediated weathering. If you have color treated or chemically processed hair, it's also going to be a lot more vulnerable to UV mediated weathering that can lead to discoloration and overall brittleness. The brand Sun Balm has a variety of hair care products, a leave-in conditioner, that are excellent and have UV filters in them for the hair strand specifically. So when you see a hair styling product that's marketed as UV protection, it may sound like a gimmick, but it definitely is important, especially if you are paying big bucks to have your hair professionally color treated. I would recommend choosing products like that, especially in the summer if you're going to be spending more time outdoors and your strands are going to be exposed. You know, you'll have a hat on, but the bottom part of your hair will be exposed. Also, not just the UV, but the combination of swimming in the pool plus the UV is like really weathering for the hair strands as well. So another thing to be mindful of, also swimming in the ocean as well. Just when the hair is wet, it's a lot more vulnerable, in other words. Plus, with the chlorine in the pool specifically, it makes the hair even more vulnerable. Is the new approved sunscreen ingredient better than PA4+? So these are two separate things. They're not necessarily related. So the new approved in the United States ingredient is not a new sunscreen ingredient. And I have many sunscreen reviews on this channel that have this ingredient. It's available widely in Asia, throughout countries in Asia, throughout countries in Europe, Canada. It's called Tinosorb S, otherwise known as bimetrizinol. It's an organic carbon compound that absorbs UV and dissipates it as heat. And we talked all about it in last weekend's video. PA rating, however, has to do with the overall formulation, the overall finish of a sunscreen. It's a test. PA testing is a test that suggests a level of UVA protection. It's done on actual human volunteers, except some countries in Europe, they use an in vitro test, meaning a lab-based test, not on people. Both testing methodologies have numerous limitations. They're not reliable. And so the PA rating is kind of nice to have, but to answer your question, you can get a PA4+ with organic carbon compound chemical sunscreen ingredients, avobenzone, octinoxate, octocrylene, that we've had in the United States for years and years. You can formulate a sunscreen that would yield in those tests a PA4+. So the new filter, it may make it easier for them to make a high UVA rated sunscreen in those tests. But again, I don't put too much stock in PA rating testing as like a feature of something being really good, because it's not something that, for example, you can't compare sunscreens. It's primarily something they do with sunscreens in like Korea and Japan, for example. You can't compare those sunscreens because they have a PA4+ rating with American sunscreens. American sunscreens don't evaluate on a PA rating system because, again, it's very flawed. It's not a reliable test. It has a lot of issues. I mean, it's fine. You know, it has merits, but it's really not that reliable. PA4+ doesn't necessarily translate across all skin tones because different skin tones respond to UVA light differently. Are there any body lotions that you know of that that contain azelaic acid. What can I do to treat, brighten, or lessen the hyperpigmentation on my arms and legs? There is a body lotion from the Korean brand APLB that has azelaic acid, which I've reviewed on here before. It's really good. I like everything I've tried from APLB, actually. They also have some facial products with azelaic acid, and azelaic acid can help definitely with hyperpigmentation. As far as lightening hyperpigmentation on the arms and legs, it really will all boil down to what the underlying root cause issue is for you. There are many different types of hyperpigmentation. Is it post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation? Are these sunspots? Is this actually hyperpigmentation, or is it lichenification, skin thickening? Are they prurigo nodules? So those are all unknowns here, so I can't really give you a specific suggestion, but I do have a lot of videos on my channel already about specific recommendations for hyperpigmentation on the body. On oral minoxidil, is it helpful to continue the 5% topical foam? So some dermatologists have done that. You know, they've decided with their patient that the patient would like to start oral minoxidil for androgenetic alopecia, and I have videos explaining why one might want that. But to cut to the chase, a lot of dermatologists will say, well, let's just keep you going along on the topical while we start this in an effort to reduce the dreaded shed, right? If you're not aware, when you stop using topical minoxidil, because the way it works, it puts more hairs in the growing phase. So when you stop it, those hairs that were put into the growing phase, you know, they don't stay there indefinitely. And so you get a massive shedding, and it's really inconvenient and frankly distressing to have the shedding. It's not permanent hair loss per se, but it is very distressing. And so the thought process was like, well, let's continue using topical minoxidil while they start the oral, and then, you know, hopefully that will reduce the risk of the dreaded shed with stopping sudden discontinuation of minoxidil. Like, let's let this systemic build up enough so that maybe they don't have that. It turns out they looked into that, and it really doesn't make a difference. Now, it is still, you know, some derms will still recommend it. The other downside of continuing is that it increases the likelihood of the adverse side effect of unwanted hypertrichosis, unwanted facial hair growth, which is a risk with the oral medication, but then now you're using the topical as well, so it can get on your face. So it's like a double hitter there. So that would be kind of the other risk. Plus, one of the main reasons why people often will want to give up with the topicals is that they can be irritating. People might develop scalp irritation, in which case, like, there's no point in continuing to suffer with that. I have read some pretty amazing claims for the Synerva Lift and Lock System. Would you comment on the ingredients and whether this is a good investment for aging 75-year-old skin? So I looked into this. It's a serum and a dietary supplement mambo combo. This serum has ascorbic acid. It has a peptide called Synerva, which is sort of thought to mimic how neuromodulators work, although the likelihood that it actually gets in and targets the neuromuscular junction, you know, is kind of unlikely. And it also has hyaluronic acid and glycerin. So, you know, ascorbic acid can help offset oxidative stress, and depending on how the product is formulated, if the ascorbic acid is actually stable and if it actually gets into your skin, it can improve collagen production. Now, is that going to lift and lock? No. It'll help to diminish wrinkle depth and improve the appearance of the surface of the skin as it relates to sun damage. Likewise, the hyaluronic acid, the glycerin, those are moisturizing. They help improve water content in the skin, and that can lessen wrinkle depth. But those ingredients are not going to lift and lock anything. If you have saggy skin, it's not going to do anything. Like, for example, jowls, it's not going to lift a jowl. Now, the dietary supplement contains biotin, which I've cautioned about biotin supplementation. Not only has it not been shown to really do much for the skin, if anything, it really hasn't been shown to do anything, okay, let alone lift and lock anything. Taking biotin supplements, however, can interfere with the accuracy of your blood work. So your thyroid tests can get messed up, and the tests that they would have to order to figure out if you're having a heart attack or not when you suddenly develop chest pain in the middle of the night and go to the ER, those will be messed up too. And so I just think that the whole biotin supplement stuff is like more risk than benefit, because there's really no benefit to taking biotin supplements unless you have a confirmed biotin deficiency, which most people don't. Now, the other stuff going on in this, I noticed they have zinc, which zinc, of course, is wonderful for the skin. However, zinc supplementation can interfere with the absorption of copper, and you can get copper deficiency as a result of taking high doses of zinc. And, you know, if you're not zinc deficient, then if you're wondering, am I zinc deficient? See your doctor, of course. Blood work would be helpful. The right blood test, however, not just any blood test. And check out my video on warning signs of zinc deficiency. Trust me, you probably are not zinc deficient. Regardless, the other thing about this website is they don't really really allow, they say these are the, award-winning ingredients in our formulation. And they call out, ascorbic acid and the serum and the peptide, the ones they want you to know are in there. But they don't really show you the ingredients in the serum. So I don't know what else is in there really. And they don't show you the ingredients or the doses in the dietary supplements. So based on that alone, it's like, what are we even buying here? What are we even buying here? Is it going to lift and lock? No, I would not waste my money on that. Can you please explain the differences between the different ceramides, EOP, NP, NG, etc.? Also, in some products, I see 1 or 2 of these listed, and in others, all or more are listed. Does that matter? So the letters are important in that they describe the molecule's exact structure. Ceramides are actually different lipids all under the same category. It's not like retinol is one main ingredient, right? Retinoic acid. It's constituents of your skin that are ceramides. Ceramide NP is actually the most abundant in your skin and the most well studied. The first letter actually has to do with the fatty acid type, and the second letter refers to the sphingosine base. So, chemistry aside, that's really what that's referring to. Does it matter if you have multiple different types of ceramides or just one? Is that good enough? And we really don't have good research on that at all. The studies that we have are mostly looking at ceramide NP. The other thing, it's likely beneficial to have a ceramide in there. Whether or not you need multiple or is multiple offering additional benefit, we really just don't know. It's probably good to have the other ones, but is it necessary to get the same result, which ultimately is improvement in barrier integrity? Probably not. Now, the delivery system is also going to matter a lot as well. Likely, are these formulated in a way that they effectively get onto the skin and help with improving natural ceramide production in your skin? But do you actually need to mimic the natural ratios of ceramides in your skin in order to benefit from using a topical ceramide? I don't think that we've adequately answered that question yet. Is Biore UV sunscreen good, and does it contain the new sunscreen ingredient? I think is what they're asking. Okay, so Biore has a few different sunscreens. They have sunscreens in Japan, which are very good, and they do contain the newly approved, again, not a new ingredient, but the newly approved in the United States, Tinosorb S. They do contain that, the Biore UV Aqua Rich Watery Essence. I have used in the past many of those Biore sunscreens. They were some of the first Japanese sunscreens I ever tried. I really, really liked them. They do have fragrance, the ones from Japan. They have like a light lemon citrus scent. It's not strong or headache inducing, but if you're allergic to fragrance, you would want to avoid. I really liked them. Like most Japanese sunscreens, they're more of a lightweight, watery gel that's a lot more comfortable to use. Now, Biore has a similarly branded, if you will, UV sunscreen that they made for the United States market before the approval of Tinosorb S. And the one approved in the US market I have not used. It was available at Costco for a while, and I would always get comments in the videos that I would do in Costco asking you guys, have you tried this? People would say, oh yeah, it's not great. It's definitely not like the ones in Japan, of course, but it's just not, some of our regular American sunscreens here are even better than that one. So I've never actually used it, so I can't say for sure how it compares, but the one that we have here now does not contain Tinosorb S. So I don't know when brands will start using Tinosorb S. It'll probably be a while, and it probably will improve our sunscreens, but I think a lot of people are overly optimistic that all of a sudden we're going to have sunscreens that are as aesthetically desirable as those in other countries when we just got one new ingredient, not all of those others. So, it's a step forward, but I would not assume that it's going to drastically change sunscreens that much as far as the aesthetics. It might. I just don't know. I'm not a cosmetic chemist formulator. I don't know. I think it'll make it easier for them to make really good protection level sunscreens because they have an additional ingredient to work with. But I don't really know how close to the aesthetics of the formulas that are available in other countries it'll bring us. Closer than we are. But I also got a lot of questions about how much this will cost. I have no idea. That all depends on how much it'll cost brands to use the ingredient. Sourcing will make a difference. I know nothing about sunscreen ingredient sourcing, the manufacturer, distributor, or whatever. I know that impacts things, and so if it's costly for the brand to work with, there's enough consumer demand for it, which sounds like there is, they'll make them, but the cost will be put on the consumer. Brands are there to make money. That's always the case. They're not there to fulfill a philanthropic need for sunscreen. Hopefully there'll be competition and people who can come up with a good one, maybe it'll be competitive. Who knows? But sunscreens in general right now are pretty darn expensive in the United States. They're pretty expensive to reliably use on the body, for example. The amount that you need, yeah, they're pretty expensive. So I can't imagine that the new filter is going to be magically like super cheap. I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Would there be a benefit for me in using skincare like retinol, etc., to improve collagen? I was under the impression that not only is my ability to produce collagen defective, but the collagen itself I produce is defective too. Would there even be a point? Well, we don't actually know, honestly, if the collagen that you produce is too defective. So Ehlers-Danlos is actually many different diseases, but the hypermobile one is the only variant of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome for which there is no there's still a lot of research going on about it. There has not yet been an identified associated genetic mutation. All the others have some sort of underlying problem with like either collagen or some other structural protein that gives rise to symptoms, but hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is not clear. If you're not aware, the hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome patients, they do have associated cutaneous manifestations, all of which I outlined in my video on skin signs of hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So I'm not going to repeat everything from that video in this, but one of them is like soft, velvety, thin skin, and that's actually been found to be related to not collagen, but rather filaggrin, which is a key component of the skin barrier. Patients who have problems with filaggrin or have dry skin. They have ichthyosis and atopic dermatitis commonly. Hyperlinear palms is a manifestation of that, but it's not clear that if or what the collagen problem is with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And no one's really looked to find out if skincare products that aim at boosting collagen production are effective or not in those patients. So we don't know. Long story, a lot of yammering to say we have no clue if it's going to be a benefit to you or not. If anything, using those products will help moisturize your skin, which is probably, presumably, more inclined to dryness, but also maybe more inclined to sensitivity. So, it could backfire. That being, now that I think of it, it could backfire. You may be more sensitive. Your skin may be more sensitive. So it's going to vary from person to person. Same as anything. Well, guys, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for leaving your questions, and I hope you enjoyed today's Q&A. Come back tomorrow because I will be doing, of course, part 2. Thank you so much for making it to the end. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and as always, don't forget, sunscreen and subscribe. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye.